we're going to look at the difference between a food chain and a food web, because both give different kinds of information pertaining to a specific ecosystem. First things first, we're going to look at the food chain. Now, a food chain is a linear description of what is going on in an ecosystem. And by linear, I mean that it actually just forms a straight line from where we started to where we end up, in terms of what gets eaten by what, gets eaten by what, gets eaten by what. And this actual image uses a lot of the vocabulary that we've just talked about. So in this case, we see that the actual food chain, which always, any food web or food chain is going to start with a producer. And the reason it starts with producers is because producers can make their own food. They do this through a process called photosynthesis. And we saw in the matter cycle that plants are able to use the energy from the sun to actually create their own sugars. Okay, and they feed themselves by eating the sugars that they actually make. We say that plants are autotrophs. Now, an autotroph, if we break this word down into two, it actually explains what the word means. Auto means self. Okay, and troph means feeding or food. So in this case, producers are autotrophs because they're able to self-feed. Now, you'll notice in this food chain that the arrows, and an arrow in any food chain or food web always points away from what is being eaten towards what is doing the eating. So in this case, the arrow goes from the actual maize or corn to the locust, which is a grasshopper. And what that actually implies is all the energy that is in this food substance is going to get consumed by this organism, which means the energy that was in here or in the portion that the grasshopper ate is now inside the grasshopper's body, being used for day-to-day activities. Okay? Now, we'll notice, too, that arrows appear all along a food chain and a food web. So what ends up happening here, when this actual grasshopper or locust gets consumed by the lizard, all of the energy that is in this guy then gets put into this guy. Now, it's not 100% efficient because when the grasshopper ate, the grasshopper used some of that initial energy to actually jump around, to fly away, to look for more food, to lay eggs, to do this, that, or the other. So not all of the energy that is in the grasshopper makes its way to the lizard. This is why the lizard has to eat, it's got to eat a fair number of grasshoppers or insects to make sure that it gets all of the energy it needs. The same goes for the lizard here, who now has energy and gets consumed by the snake. So the energy that was in the lizard goes into the snake. Now, this progression of energy, all right, is why we have the actual arrows that go from one actual organism to the next, to the next. So if we go back to our original image here, all food chains are going to start with a producer. And anything that does not make its own food, anything that must eat something, is known as a consumer. Because they must consume their actual energy from an outside source. And we know that there are different kinds of consumers. we know that consumers that only eat vegetables, okay, or only eat plant matter, all right, we know that those actual consumers are known as herbivores. So here we have our locust, which is a primary consumer. Primary means it's the first consumer in the chain. It is also known as a herbivore. Now, the lizard is the second consumer in the actual food chain, but it is not an herbivore. It is eating an animal. Therefore, it is a carnivore. Now, the words primary, secondary, and tertiary here mean primary means 1, secondary means 2, and tertiary means 3. But in this case, in terms of actual carnivores, we see that there are 2. So we could also call this actual lizard a primary carnivore. I'm happy with you just calling it a carnivore. Equally, even though the snake is a tertiary, or it's the third consumer in the chain, it is the secondary carnivore. Now, we talked about in class already the fact that foodstuff or food chains can actually be shown in the form of a pyramid, an energy pyramid, where we always have our producers at the bottom, and we know that there are many, many, many producers. Then we've got our herbivores, and we see that there are fewer of them. And then we've got our carnivores, and we've got our primary carnivores, and then we've got our secondary carnivores. Okay? So each of these sections equates to a part on the actual chain. Now, we know that the higher up you get in a food chain, the further along you get, the least amount of organisms are going to be able to inhabit a certain area and feed on a certain thing. Because if you had as many snakes as you have lizards, you would run out of lizards. Same goes for the amount of lizards versus the amount of locusts. Okay, as we move up the food chain, there are less and less of these organisms. Now, food webs are a lot more complicated because within a food web, you have all of the possible food chains in an actual ecosystem. So in a particular area, these are all of the organisms, plants and animals, that are there. The only organisms that are missing in most food webs are decomposers. Okay? Now, and in this case, we actually have some decomposers because we have actual insects. But if we look at this, if we were to count how many food chains there actually are in this actual food web, we'd see that there are many. Because if you want to outline every possible food chain, you start at a producer and you make your way up until you get to an apex predator. Okay, so here this one veers off and goes here. This one goes up and goes, oh, I just did that one. This one goes up and goes here. This one goes up and goes here. Okay, same goes for the next one, which then goes up. All right, so you can see how crazy and mixed up this is going to get. Now, here's the interesting part of an actual food web. If we take an organism out of this food web, if we said that all of the, all of the insects disappeared from this food web. So all of the insects here mean these guys. We don't have this anymore. We don't have this anymore. Or this, or this, or this. Okay, these guys are gone. So anything that is gone there is going to cause the organism that eats it to then get very, very hungry. And their numbers would actually drop. Okay, so the frog's numbers would drop if there were no more dragonflies or butterflies or grasshoppers. Okay, the titmouse would also pretty much starve. All right, now if there's no titmice and there's no frogs, the next thing to go is going to be the actual snake. All right, in this case, the buzzard feeds on both the titmouse and the snake. And if these guys end up starving to death and leaving, it means that the buzzard is going to actually lose a lot of its food. It's going to have to rely a lot more on the rabbit and the mouse. Same goes for the fox. So what do you think is going to happen to the populations immediately of mice and rabbits? Even though the mice and the rabbits don't actually eat any of the insects, they will still be impacted if some of these organisms are removed from the actual food web. Every actual organism, the entire food web gets impacted one way or another. These numbers will eventually go down, which will then cause these guys to go down. The only organisms that are actually going to benefit from this are your producers. Okay? The producers, because nobody else is eating them, will actually grow and grow and grow. So we see that every actual organism in a food web gets impacted if only one organism gets removed. Okay? And a food web will always show a much clearer picture of what's going on in an ecosystem versus just your food chain.